Shalom and welcome to Secrets Revealed, the Holy Bible. Today, we're going to look at Leviticus chapter 4. There are 35 verses. Verse 3, we see a big difference. Cause the people to sin. If the anointed priest sin, so as to cause the people to sin, versus the priest that is anointed do sin according to the sin of the people. That is a rather large difference. In the sept, you have the priest setting a poor example. He's the one influencing the community, the people, to follow after his sin, after his mistakes, after his bad behavior. Whereas in the Maz, you have the priest that follows the bad behavior of the people. So you have a bit of peer pressure. So recall the golden calf incident, and you have Aaron who was pressured by the people to do wrong, to commit sin. So that's what the Maz is talking about. Whereas in the Sept, that is more akin to a king who, for example, decides to build idols, and they tell the people to worship this idol. So he's leading the people into sin. And that's what you see in the Sept. That's what we're going with. Now, if you don't know already, the purpose of these videos of this series, Secrets Revealed, the Holy Bible, is to look, to contrast, to compare diligently the Masoretic text, which is widely accepted as the golden standard for the Holy Scriptures, which is the King James Version and all the versions that stem out of it. And on the other hand, you have the Septuagint, which is the text that existed during the time of Jesus Christ, Yehoshua HaMashiach. And that was actually even 300 years before he was born as a human being. Before he existed as a human being, the Septuagint was and still is, whereas the Masoretic existed at least, I think it was 700 years after Jesus Christ, Yehoshua, and then was only finalized in its current form 1,000 years after his existence on this planet as a human being. So that's the point of the series, in case you didn't know. And I don't want to waste too much time talking about that, but maybe I'll just do a brief spiel about that every video. And why is it important? Well, because if you are like me and you do believe that the Holy Bible is the Word of God, this is probably the most important thing in existence. And I'm really surprised that I'm practically the only person on this whole planet of 7 billion people doing this line by line from cover to cover. People like to buy gold, they like to buy Bitcoin, all these things. But when it comes to this, which is more valuable than all those things put together, you have hardly anyone mining this gold. And but anyway, it really didn't come from me. I really believe that the Father put it in my heart to do this, and He's blessed me immensely to have the technology to do this. I'm not saying this is the most high tech operation in the world, but for what it is and for what I need to do, this is sufficient, and I'm just thankful for that. So I'm going to continue on with the differences between the Septuagint, and the Masoretic text. Okay, in verse 5, we see here who has been consecrated. So the anointed priest who has been consecrated was omitted. Verse 6, sprinkle. For once, they both say sprinkle. Usually there's a difference. One will say poured, and that's usually the sept, and sprinkle will usually be in the Maz. Verse 7, of the calf, the blood of the calf was omitted, and then poor is actually poor in both. So you can see the Maz is saying poor, poor. Why all the discrepancies then? That's a big question. And if you would please, those of my viewers would please comment. Do you want me to talk right up to the mic? Is it better sound quality, or do you prefer if I take it, go back a little bit, and then put my pop filter up? Maybe that's better. But please let me know, because if you don't, I'm just going to keep going like this. And I prefer it this way because it does sound like a professional radio broadcast. And I've kind of wanted to be a radio broadcaster for a long time. So here we go. Verse 9, on the liver versus above the liver. Uh, that's a significant difference. If you're being very uh, technical, something is on the liver, like a cyst, that's on the liver. But if it's above the liver, it's not on the liver, it's above it. Um, verse 11, the belly versus the inwards. Let me just point out the previous one, so you don't think I'm pulling a fast one on you. Where is it? On the liver. There you go. And then above the liver. The next verse is 13, escape notice. So if the whole congregation of Israel trespass ignorantly, and a thing should escape the notice of the congregation, and they should do one thing forbidden of any of the commands of Yah, which ought not to be done, and should transgress. So from escape the notice, up to transgress, I think up to the end, versus the thing. So the thing should be hid from the eyes of the assembly. So one thing in the sept, it's escaping their notice. So it sounds like it's more from the sense of the reading, and that's what we do a lot here, is making sense of the reading. If something escapes your notice, that is it's not an intentional mistake. That's a unintentional mistake, to put it simply. That's not something you did purposefully. But if a thing is hid from the eyes of the assembly, that's deceit. You're trying to deceive. Okay, reading on, continuing on. And they should do one thing forbidden of any of the commandments of Yah, verses, and they have done any of the commandments of Yah, because recall, these in brackets aren't actually there. They have done any of the commandments of Yah which should not be done. So if you're doing a commandment which should not be done, doesn't make too much sense. But if you read in the Sept that it's forbidden, completely against the commands, that's more clear cut. This is a little nebulous in the Maz. And then reading on, which ought not to be done and should transgress, okay, and are guilty. So uh, if you transgress, you've broken the command. But if you're guilty, the sentence has been given. The verdict is there, okay? Verse 17, of the sanctuary, the veil of the sanctuary was omitted, of the sanctuary part. Verse 18, of the incense of composition was omitted as well. And then which is by the door, right here, the last part of the tabernacle of witness was omitted, specifically is by, because it does say which of the door, but does not include is by the door. In the Maz, it can be taken if you don't have those brackets there, because remember, recall those are inserted by the editors. If that's not there, you're reading which the door, so that could be which is the door. No, it's is by the door, and that's why it's not in brackets here. How would they know to put that in, to insert this, if the Septuagint didn't exist? Ah, that's the big question, isn't it? Verse 21, the whole verse has been omitted, or maybe it's just the word whole. Let me read this in completion. And they shall carry forth the calf whole. Okay, so it's the word whole. Whole without the camp. So you're carrying it whole, the whole thing, versus the bullock. So it could be, hey, it could be parts of the bullock, but no, it says the whole. It's in its entirety. Verse 33 um, it says that whole is omitted again, whole burnt offerings. There seems to be a continuous difference. And then verse 34, we see the same thing, whole burnt offerings. So that's all for chapter 4. Let's move on to chapter 5. Leviticus chapter 5. Let me just make sure I am recording. Looks like I am. Okay. There are 19 verses in Leviticus chapter 5. Verse 1, we see the first difference, report versus utter, which means to speak. Verse 2 is a significant difference, a sig diff. We read here, unclean being taken of beasts versus a carcass of an unclean beast. So that is not the same at all. In verse 4, the unrighteous soul, that unrighteous soul versus if a soul swear. So it's more specific that this is a individual that is unrighteous, which determines with his lips to do evil. Makes sense. An unrighteous person will tend to do that versus a soul swear, pronouncing with his lips to do evil or to do good. Okay, well, it does say an unrighteous soul which determines to do good. Okay, so anyhow, it does say that unrighteous soul versus a soul swear. That's a big difference. And then it says here, and it shall escape his notice. Uh, the oath, that's what it's talking about. If the oath escapes his notice, versus it be hid from him. So again, you have him just not being attentive versus it being hid from him. Either someone else has hidden it from him, or he just did not pay attention. Okay, hold on one moment. Let me just make sure everything's going. Okay, continuing on. And he should sin, in verse 4, and he should sin, he shall he shall know about the thing escaping his notice. And so he should sin in some of these things. I think that's referring to his oath. Versus when he knows, then he shall be guilty in one of these. So what's the difference between these two translations, specifically in this verse? Well, we see that there's an action in the sept, that he's sinning. An action is taking place, and in the Maz, there is no action. He's just determined to be guilty. So the action follows in the sept. It's not only because of what came before, meaning the oath he's made, but also because that he did actually sin through his actions, his or her actions, as well as the oath that was made. Okay, so that's verse 4. Verse 5, uh, when he shall be guilty, when he shall be guilty was added. So how is this determined, meaning his guilt? How do they determine this? If the action was never committed in the Masoretic text, he didn't do anything wrong. He shall confess that he sinned, but he didn't do an action. Is it because he was ignorant? Is that his sin, being ignorant? So that's a big question to ask. Verse 6, a ewe lamb versus a female from the flock. Could be any kind of animal from the flock, but this is a ewe lamb. And then a lamb. Uh, where am I here? Two choices versus three choices. So you have two choices here, a ewe lamb or a kid of the goats. And the Maz, you have a female from the flock, a lamb, or a kid. And his sin shall be forgiven him. So he's making an atonement, or the priest rather is making an atonement for this person. And his sin shall be forgiven him. That is a big difference. That was omitted. You can't find that in the Masoretic text. Verse 8, pinch versus ring. Pinch off the head, talking about, I believe this is a bird. They're bringing pigeons or doves. So you're supposed to pinch off the head from the neck, or the priest is supposed to do that, versus ring off the head. I'd say they're pretty similar. And then you divide the body, or you shall not divide the body, versus you shall not divide it asunder. Okay. I wouldn't say that's a huge difference, but verse 8, there's no division at all of the body. Verse 8, if you're going to be very clever or cunning, or if you're going to be like, devil's advocate, you can divide it in maybe 4 pieces, but asunder is usually 2 pieces. I believe that's the way that's read. Whereas the sept doesn't, there's no exceptions, zero tolerance of dividing. Verse 9, to drop, he shall drop at the blood. I'm sorry, talking about the blood. The rest of the blood he shall drop at the foot of the altar. It sounds like you're pouring this blood. It's not solid blood that has been frozen. You're dropping it, but I think this is more pouring the blood out when it says drop it at the foot of the altar. So you're dropping the blood and just spilling it. Versus wring out. It shall be wrung out at the bottom of the altar. So when I read the words wrung out, I think of like a cloth that's soaked in blood, and then you just, you're wringing out a towel, right? Verse 10, the whole burnt offering versus burnt offering. You'll notice this is a continuous difference, and we noticed that in the previous chapter as well. But notice here that the first offering was not forgiven in the Masoretic text. We pointed that out in verse 6. And then notice that the second one, the second whole burnt offering, it shall be forgiven him. And then it says the same thing. It shall be forgiven him. So why make an exception for the first one? Why wasn't that accepted in the Masoretic text? Right? These are serious questions. And I'm not trying to be facetious or anything like that. It's an honest question. Why isn't it? This gives more credence, more credibility to the Septuagint and less to the Masoretic. Because doesn't it say in Revelation, the book of Revelation, that whoever adds or removes to this word will have the plagues added, or I believe it's their part removed out of the book of life? Like, this is so serious. I'm not saying this difference is cataclysmic and is going to, that's not up to me to decide, right? But you can see when you start adding little by little, and it accumulates over the course of thousands of words and pages, and then you do the same thing on the other spectrum, and you remove and remove and remove, or you conceal, and you conceal, or you replace certain names. That's a big problem. You're going to not have the same religion, the same doctrine, the same fundamental beliefs. You're going to have a, a large gap, a great divide. And that's what we have in today's world, where you have people proclaiming to be of certain religious faiths, and then when you line it up with the Bible, with the Septuagint specifically, they just don't match up. So that would beg the question, if Yehoshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ, Jesus the Christ, or the Father were to come down to the earth, would he recognize his believers, not just by appearance, but by their hearts, their desires, their words, and by their actions, how they live their life, what days they keep, what rules they follow? Are they observing the seventh day, Sabbath? Are they keeping the holy days in Leviticus 23 that we're going to cover soon? Are they observing and guarding the Shemitah, the land Sabbath, those who own land and do agriculture? Are they doing the Jubilee, the 50th year of release? So many things. There's so many. I can name tons of them, but those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head, because quite frankly, a lot of people are not keeping these things. Okay, that's my rant. But these are questions we should be asking. Okay, and this is why this program is important, the series that I'm doing. Moving on, I don't like to preach too much, but sometimes you just have to call a spade a spade. All right, moving on to verse 10. Okay, we did this one. Verse 10 says here, the sept correctly says both were. So in verse 6 in this verse, you can see that. Verse 11, afford. If he cannot afford a pair of turtle doves, then he shall bring as his gift for his sin the tenth part of an ephah of fine flour. So it explains to you why he cannot, because he cannot afford it. He's probably poor or destitute, just does not have this financial means. Whereas in the Maz, it says if he's not able to, why wouldn't he be able to? Well, it's just more specific in the Sept, saying this is why. Verse 13, and that which is left, uh, talking about the atonement, the sacrifices, and in particular, this one is talking about the fine flour. Whatever is left shall be the priest's. Okay. And here it's saying, shall be forgiven him and shall be the priest. What shall be the priest? As a meat offering. Doesn't say. The brackets don't exist. Again, they don't exist. But how would they know that it was the remnant if this Septuagint did not exist? That's a key point in all of this research. It's a key point. Because you can't just guess the right thing. Take a shot in the dark and say, oh, it's probably the remnant. Make an assumption. That's not the way it works. Just by instinct or just by using your vast knowledge or your experience is not how things work. It could be anything. So in verse 13, an offering of fine flour, right there, as an offering of fine flour, versus shall be the priest as a meat offering. So because in our modern vernacular, when we see meat, we think of meat, not bread. Although I think that's what it means when it says meat, it means like a meal or a bread. But I have to qualify this that it is fine flour. It's not meat. It's not from an animal. It is made of fine flour. Verse 11 is explicit. it's a tenth part of an ephah of fine flour. And it says the same thing in the Mass. So moving on to verse 15, really unconscious. Okay, it starts here, really unconscious. The soul which shall be really unconscious and shall sin unwillingly, versus if a soul commit a trespass and sin through ignorance and the holy things. Okay, so this is you can see the contrast here is that they're unwillingly sinning. They just don't know. They're not conscious of it. Maybe they're not actively awake, or just not actively present. There's some problem here. There's a problem. He didn't do this willingly. It was not intentional. And then you have the Maz saying he committed a trespass, but it was done through ignorance. Uh, Whereas it makes more sense that it's unwilling. He didn't willingly do it. It wasn't a rebellious sin. And he was not even conscious of it either. He was not aware of it. Whereas here, it doesn't really give that leeway to say that, I mean, yeah, ignorance is part of it, but you can still be ignorant and still rebellious. It's possible. I didn't know, but I still didn't care. He didn't really care. Maybe it was negligence, perhaps. Uh, so it's double stressed, and it's double stressed in the sept that it was not intentional. It was not intentional and unknowingly. Okay. So notice that not only was he not conscious of it or aware of it, but he didn't do it intentionally, willingly. So it's double stressed. Whereas in the Maz, it is somewhat pointed out through ignorance only, though. Okay. Verse 16, we see sinned. The word sinned. He shall make compensation for that wherein he has sinned, versus he shall make amends for the harm that he has done. Uh, that's an interesting translation. Sin is a transgression of the law of Elohim, but harm is not necessarily transgression of the law of Elohim. It could simply be a transgression of a human law. For example, if I don't like people walking on my lawn, that's not a law of Elohim. But if they walk on my lawn, they cause me harm because I didn't like that. I was offended. So you can see that's it's very subtle, that difference, but it can be it can diverge fundamentally and doctrinally. So you know what? I'm going to qualify this and say this is a huge difference just because of the example I shared with you, and many possible instances where, hypothetical situations where you could use this. And then you have things versus thing, holy things versus the holy thing. Okay, verse 17. If the soul which shall sin and do one thing, any of the commandments of Yah, which it is not right to do, so he's not doing the right thing, versus if a soul sin and commit any of these things which are forbidden to be done by the commandment of Yah, though he he did not know it. So it's one thing to, which is not right to do, versus forbidden to be done. I don't think they're a big difference. I don't think that's a big difference, to be honest. It's just worded differently. And then verse 18 is the last verse we're going to look at. I'm going to just stick to 4 and 5 at this point in time. I don't think we need to do 3 chapters again. I don't want to make the videos too long, excessively long. I think this was probably 30 minutes. So I want to stick to 30 minutes or less for the videos moving forward. That's the ideal length of time. And then verse 18, we see here, at a price of silver versus with thy estimation. So it is specific. It is going to be priced using silver as the currency versus an estimation, which could be anything. It could be whatever you want to use, right? But here it does say silver. So that's all for these two chapters, Leviticus chapters 4 and 5. Thank you very much for your time. May your Father bless you and make your way prosperous. You've been watching Secrets Revealed, the Holy Bible. Shalom.